Harlem, 1932. A man lies bleeding in the street. The sound of gunfire still echoes off brownstone walls. This isn't just another casualty of the numbers war, this is a message. Before he was the Godfather of Harlem, before his name struck fear into the hearts of mobsters and cops alike, Bumpy Johnson was a weapon, and the woman who wielded that weapon was the most powerful person you've never heard of. Her name was Stephanie St. Clair, Madame St. Clair, the Queen of Numbers. This is her story. This is the untold history of Harlem's first crime boss. To uncover the truth buried by decades of silence, subscribe to the archives. Because what you're about to hear changes everything you thought you knew about organized crime in America. 1930. While Wall Street burned and bread lines stretched for blocks, one woman in Harlem was getting rich. Not just comfortable, filthy rich. Stephanie St. Clair arrived in New York from Martinique with nothing but ambition and a razor-sharp mind. Within 5 years, she controlled an empire. The numbers racket, an illegal lottery that ran on nickels and dimes from washerwomen, porters, and factory workers. Pocket change that added up to $40,000 a week. In today's money, that's over $800,000. Every single week. She lived like royalty. A townhouse on Sugar Hill, fur coats, diamonds, a chauffeur-driven Cadillac. But Stephanie St. Clair wasn't just rich. She was untouchable. While male gangsters paid off cops and politicians, Stephanie had something better. She had respect. She paid her workers fairly. She never watered down the odds. And she protected her neighborhood like it was her own family. The people of Harlem didn't just play her numbers. They loved her. But empires need enforcers. And that's where Ellsworth Raymond Johnson comes in. 1930. A young man steps off a train at Pennsylvania Station. He's 25 years old, 6 feet tall, with eyes that have already seen too much. His name is Bumpy Johnson, and he's running from a murder charge in Charleston, South Carolina. Bumpy didn't come to New York for a fresh start. He came because he had no choice. Charleston was too hot, too small, and Bumpy Johnson was too dangerous to stay. Within weeks, he's working protection for small-time numbers runners in San Juan Hill. He's good at it. Too good. Because Bumpy Johnson isn't just muscle. He's smart, strategic, ruthless when he needs to be, but never wasteful. He studies the streets like a chessboard. He learns who pays, who doesn't, and who's vulnerable. And then one day, he catches someone's attention. Stephanie St. Clair didn't hire just anyone. She'd built her operation by trusting no one and watching everything. But when she heard about the young enforcer who'd stopped a robbery without firing a shot, who'd negotiated a territorial dispute that should have ended in bloodshed, she wanted to meet him. Their first meeting happened in the back room of a speakeasy on Lenox Avenue. Stephanie sat behind a mahogany desk, smoking a cigarette in a jade holder. Bumpy stood in front of her, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes steady. She asked him one question. "Why should I trust you?" Bumpy's answer was simple. "You shouldn't. But you can use me." Stephanie smiled. And in that moment, the most dangerous partnership in Harlem history was born. Bumpy Johnson became Stephanie St. Clair's chief enforcer, her strategist, her weapon. He didn't just protect her numbers operation. He expanded it. He eliminated threats before they became problems. He negotiated deals that kept the peace and maximized profit. And when negotiation failed, Bumpy made examples. But this wasn't a simple boss and hired gun relationship. Stephanie saw something in Bumpy that no one else did. Potential, intelligence, loyalty earned, not bought. And Bumpy saw in Stephanie something he'd never seen before. A black woman who refused to bow, who built power in a world designed to crush her, who played the game better than men who'd been playing it for generations. They weren't equals, not yet. But they understood each other. And in the world of Harlem's underworld, understanding was more valuable than gold. By 1931, Stephanie St. Clair's empire was at its peak. 40 numbers banks across Harlem, runners on every block, weekly profits that rivaled legitimate businesses. And standing behind her, silent and deadly, was Bumpy Johnson. But the golden age was about to end. Because downtown, in the boardrooms of Manhattan, Powerful men were noticing Harlem's success. Dutch Schultz, Lucky Luciano, the Italian mob. They'd conquered bootlegging during Prohibition. Now they wanted the numbers. And they weren't asking permission. The war for Harlem was coming, and it would transform Bumpy Johnson from a weapon into a legend. Bumpy Johnson knew how to break bones, how to instill fear with a look, how to make problems disappear in the middle of the night. But Stephanie St. Clair knew something Bumpy didn't. Violence is the language of amateurs. Power speaks in whispers, and she was about to teach him a new language. It started with a suit, custom-tailored, charcoal gray wool with subtle pinstripes. Bumpy stood in the tailor's shop on 125th Street, uncomfortable, while an old Italian man measured his shoulders. Stephanie watched from a leather chair, smoking. "This is unnecessary," Bumpy said. "I'm not going to tea parties." Stephanie exhaled smoke slowly. "Every man in Harlem knows you work for me. They see you in street clothes, they see muscle. They see you in that suit, they see authority. There's a difference. The suit was just the beginning." Stephanie St. Clair didn't need another thug. Harlem had plenty of those. She needed a strategist, a thinker, someone who could see 3 moves ahead. So she decided to build one. 3 nights a week, after the numbers were collected and the runners had gone home, Bumpy would come to Stephanie's townhouse. Not to the office, to her private study. Leather-bound books lined the walls. A chess set sat on a side table. And Stephanie St. Clair would teach. She taught him history, not the sanitized version from white textbooks. The real history. Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution. How enslaved people defeated 3 European empires. How strategy and patience triumph over superior force. She taught him about Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois, about economic power and political leverage, about how black people in America had always fought 2 wars, the visible one against oppression and the invisible one for respect. But most importantly, she taught him chess. "Do you know the difference between chess and checkers, Bumpy?" He didn't answer. In checkers, every piece moves the same way. In chess, every piece has a different power, a different purpose, and the most powerful piece isn't the one that moves the most, it's the one that controls the board. She moved a queen across the board, not taking anything, just repositioning. You've been playing checkers in a chess game, and that's why you'll lose. Bumpy learned quickly, because beneath the street fighter was a mind that had never been challenged, never been given the tools to reach its potential. Stephanie saw what Charleston had missed, what poverty and racism had buried. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just dangerous, he was brilliant. Within months, the transformation was visible. Bumpy walked differently, talked differently. He read the Amsterdam News every morning. He quoted Langston Hughes. He wore 3-piece suits and carried himself like a businessman, because that's what Stephanie was teaching him to be. But the most important lesson wasn't about culture or education. It was about restraint. A runner named Tommy had been skimming. Small amounts at first, then larger. By the time Stephanie found out, he'd stolen nearly $3,000. Bumpy wanted to handle it the old way, permanently. Stephanie stopped him with a single question. "Then what?" Bumpy looked at her, confused. "Then he's gone." Problem solved. Stephanie shook her head. "Tommy has a wife, 3 children. His wife's brother runs numbers in the Bronx. His cousin works for the Policy Bank on 8th Avenue. You kill Tommy, you lose his family. You lose his connections. You start a feud that costs more than $3,000. So what do? We make him pay it back, with interest. We demote him but keep him working. We let everyone see that we punish theft, but we don't waste assets. Dead men don't pay debts, Bumpy, and they don't fear you either. They're just gone." It was a revelation. Violence wasn't power. It was a tool. And like any tool, it was only useful when applied at the right time, in the right way, for the right reason. Stephanie was teaching Bumpy to see the streets of Harlem as a chessboard. Every player had a role. Every action had consequences 3 moves down the line. And the goal wasn't to eliminate every opponent. It was to control the game. But while Bumpy was learning to play chess, someone downtown was playing a different game entirely. Dutch Schultz wasn't interested in strategy. He wasn't interested in respect. The Dutchman wanted Harlem, and he wanted it now. And unlike Stephanie St. Clair, Dutch Schultz believed that violence was the only language worth speaking. The first move came on a Tuesday morning in January 1932. One of Stephanie's numbers banks on 147th Street. Two white men walked in just after opening. They didn't rob it. They bought it. Made the manager an offer. Work for Dutch Schultz or don't work at all. The manager refused. They broke both his legs. By the end of the week, 3 more banks had received visits. 2 managers took the deal. One ended up in Harlem Hospital with a fractured skull. The message was clear. Dutch Schultz was coming for the numbers, and he wasn't asking permission. When Stephanie heard the news, she was playing chess with Bumpy in her study. He was finally starting to win games. But that Tuesday, the lesson ended early. Bumpy's reaction was immediate. Let me handle this. Tonight. I'll send a message they can't ignore. Stephanie studied the chessboard. Her queen was in danger, but she had a knight positioned for a countermove 3 turns away. She looked up at Bumpy. What message would you send? That we're not afraid. That Harlem isn't for sale. That anyone who comes for us ends up in the ground. Stephanie moved her knight. Check. She looked at Bumpy. And then what? Dutch sends 10 men instead of 2. We send bodies. They send more bodies. The police get involved. The newspapers start paying attention. And while we're busy killing each other, Lucky Luciano walks in and takes everything. Bumpy stared at the board, frustrated. So we do nothing? Stephanie smiled. I didn't say that. I said we don't react. There's a difference. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at Harlem, the streets she'd controlled for nearly a decade, the neighborhood that had made her rich and powerful, the empire she'd built from nothing. Dutch Schultz thinks this is checkers. He makes a move, we make a move, someone wins. But this is chess, Bumpy. And in chess, the best move is often the one your opponent doesn't see coming. What do you want me to do? Stephanie turned from the window. Nothing. Yet. We watch. We learn. We let Dutch think he's winning. And while he's busy celebrating his small victories, we'll be planning something he can't possibly expect. Bumpy had learned a lot in the past year. But this was the hardest lesson yet. How to wait. How to endure an attack without striking back. How to trust that patience and strategy would triumph over immediate action. It went against every instinct he'd developed on the streets. But as he looked at Stephanie St. Clair, calm and confident in the face of an existential threat, he understood something new. This woman hadn't survived and thrived in a world designed to crush her by being reactive. She'd done it by being smarter than everyone else, and now she was teaching him to be the same. Dutch Schultz had made his first move, and it was a mistake, because he thought he was fighting Stephanie St. Clair, the numbers queen. He didn't know he was actually facing Stephanie St. Clair, the chess master. And her most dangerous piece was just learning how to play the game. Patience is a virtue, until it isn't. For 6 months, Stephanie St. Clair played the long game. She absorbed Dutch Schultz's attacks. She watched her empire shrink. She counseled restraint while her competitors fled or switched sides. But Dutch Schultz made a critical mistake. He confused patience with weakness. And in the spring of 1932, the war truly began. It started with fire. 3 of Stephanie's numbers banks burned in a single night. Not robberies. Arson. The buildings were empty, but the message was clear. Surrender or watch everything burn. Stephanie didn't surrender. 2 days later, one of Dutch's collectors was found in an alley off Lenox Avenue. Both hands broken, a playing card tucked into his jacket pocket, the Queen of Spades, Stephanie's calling card. Dutch Schultz responded with overwhelming force. Within a week, Harlem transformed into a war zone. Drive-by shootings in broad daylight, runners beaten on street corners, numbers banks raided by men with Tommy guns who weren't interested in money. They wanted territory, They wanted submission. The violence was calculated, strategic. Dutch Schultz wasn't just fighting Stephanie St. Clair. He was terrorizing an entire neighborhood into compliance, and it was working. One by one, the other numbers bankers made their choice. They bent the knee. They took Dutch's offer. They became employees instead of owners. Some told themselves it was survival. Others called it good business. But the result was the same. By summer, Stephanie St. Clair stood almost alone. Almost. Because while every other power player in Harlem was calculating odds and cutting deals, Bumpy Johnson made a different choice. He stayed, not out of obligation, not because Stephanie paid him. Bumpy stayed because he finally understood what Stephanie had been teaching him all along. Some things are worth more than survival. Some lines can't be crossed, and some fights have to be fought, even when the odds are impossible. This wasn't just business anymore. This was war. And Bumpy Johnson was ready. The streets of Harlem became a chessboard soaked in blood. But this time, Bumpy wasn't just muscle. He was the strategist Stephanie had trained him to be. He studied Dutch's patterns. He identified weaknesses. He turned the Dutchman's strength into a liability. Dutch had more men, more guns, more money. But Bumpy had something better. He had home field advantage. He knew every alley, every rooftop, every basement in Harlem, and he knew how to use them. The attacks became surgical. Dutch's men would arrive to collect from a policy bank and find it empty. They'd chase a runner into a building and get ambushed from 3 directions. They'd set up intimidation rackets and watch their collectors disappear one by one. Bumpy wasn't fighting a war of attrition. He was fighting a guerrilla campaign, and he was good at it. But wars cost more than money. They cost blood. A numbers runner named James took 3 bullets protecting a bank on 139th Street. A woman named Dorothy, who'd worked for Stephanie for 8 years, was beaten so badly she never walked right again. A 14-year-old boy who ran bets after school caught a stray bullet from a drive-by shooting. He survived, but his mother pulled him off the streets. One less soldier in Stephanie's army. The casualties mounted. And for the first time since arriving in New York, Stephanie St. Clair began to question whether pride was worth the price. Late one night, she sat in her study with Bumpy. The chess set remained untouched. The books gathered dust. Outside, sirens wailed. Another shooting. Another ambulance. Another family destroyed by a war over nickels and dimes. "We're losing," Bumpy said. "Not the war, but the people. They're scared. And I don't blame them." Stephanie stared at the window, watching Harlem bleed. For the first time, Bumpy saw something he'd never seen before. Doubt. Maybe Dutch was right. Maybe this isn't a fight we can win. Bumpy leaned forward. "You don't believe that." Stephanie turned to face him. "I believe that every choice has a cost. And I'm tired of watching good people pay for my pride. This isn't about pride. You taught me that. This is about principle." You bend now. Every black business owner in Harlem learns the same lesson. That white men can take whatever they want. That we're only allowed to succeed until someone more powerful decides we're not. Stephanie studied Bumpy's face. The street fighter she'd hired 2 years ago was gone. In his place was someone sharper, more dangerous. Someone who understood that some battles were about more than winning and losing. "You sound like me." Bumpy smiled. "I had a good teacher." But inspiration doesn't stop bullets, and principle doesn't pay hospital bills. Stephanie and Bumpy both knew the truth. They were outgunned, outmanned, and running out of time. Dutch Schultz had the resources to fight this war for years. Stephanie St. Clair did not. They needed a different strategy, not violence, something smarter. Something Dutch Schultz would never see coming. And then fate intervened. October 1935. The news hit Harlem like a thunderclap. Dutch Schultz had been shot. Not by Stephanie's people, by his own. Lucky Luciano and the Italian mob families had decided Dutch was too unstable, too violent, too much of a liability. So they did what mob families do. They eliminated the problem. Dutch Schultz lay dying in a Newark hospital, shot 4 times, bleeding out slowly, delirious with fever and pain. When Stephanie heard the news, she didn't celebrate. She didn't smile. She walked to her desk, pulled out a piece of telegram paper, and began to write. Bumpy watched from the doorway. "What are you doing?" Stephanie didn't look up. Sending a message. To who? "Dutch is dying." Stephanie kept writing, her handwriting precise and elegant. Exactly. The telegram would become legend, proof that Stephanie St. Clair wasn't just a crime boss. She was an artist, and her medium was revenge. But what she wrote would have to wait, because as Stephanie composed her final message to Dutch Schultz, something else was happening. Something neither she nor Bumpy had anticipated. Someone close to them was talking to the police, not about the war with Dutch. That was over. But about everything else. The numbers operation, the policy banks, the payoffs and protection rackets. Everything Stephanie had built over a decade was being documented, cataloged, and prepared for prosecution. And the informant wasn't some low-level runner or disgruntled employee. It was someone in the inner circle, someone who knew where the money flowed. Someone who'd sat in Stephanie's study and broken bread at her table. Bumpy started noticing small things. Conversations that stopped when he entered a room. Missing paperwork. Police raids that seemed too well informed. Someone was leaking information, and whoever it was had access to everything. Late one night, Bumpy pulled Stephanie aside. "We have a problem. Dutch? Worse. We have a rat." Stephanie's expression didn't change, but Bumpy saw her jaw tighten. "How do you know?" "The raids. They're too precise. They know which banks to hit and when. They know where we keep backup records. Someone's feeding them information." "Who?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." The paranoia spread like poison. Every trusted associate became a suspect. Every conversation felt dangerous. The war with Dutch Schultz had been brutal, but at least they knew who the enemy was. This was different. This was betrayal from within, and it was about to destroy everything. Dutch Schultz died on October 24, 1935. His last words were a fever dream of numbers and nonsense, but before he slipped away, a telegram was delivered to his hospital room. The nurse read it to him while he drifted in and out of consciousness. What it said would echo through Harlem for decades. A final message from the Queen to the Dutchman, but those words, dripping with venom and victory, would have to wait for another time. Because while Dutch Schultz was dying in Newark, Stephanie St. Clair's world was collapsing in Harlem. The war was over, but the real fight was just beginning. And this time, the enemy wasn't someone she could outwit or intimidate or eliminate. This time, the enemy was the law, and someone she trusted had invited them in. The war ended not with a bang, but with a telegram. Dutch Schultz was dead. The Italian mob had eliminated their problem. And Harlem, bloodied but unbroken, belonged to Stephanie St. Clair once again. She'd outlasted the Dutchman, outmaneuvered him, and in his final moments, she'd sent him a message that would become legend. But victory came at a cost neither she nor Bumpy had anticipated. The informant was never found, or maybe Stephanie knew exactly who it was and chose silence over vengeance. Either way, the damage was done. The police had everything they needed. Bank records, witness statements, a decade of criminal enterprise documented in excruciating detail. In 1936, Stephanie St. Clair was arrested. Not for murder or violence, for tax evasion. The same charge that brought down Al Capone. The government couldn't beat her on the streets, so they beat her with paperwork. She spent 8 months in prison. And when she emerged, something had changed. The Queen of Numbers was tired of the game. Stephanie St. Clair had spent 15 years building an empire in the shadows. She'd fought corrupt cops, racist politicians, and the Italian mob. She'd won battles that should have been impossible. But imprisonment had given her time to think, time to see what she'd become, and time to imagine what she could be instead. When she returned to Harlem, she didn't rebuild her numbers operation. She pivoted. Stephanie St. Clair became Stephanie St. Clair the activist, the civil rights advocate, the voice for justice in a neighborhood that desperately needed one. She wrote letters to newspapers exposing police corruption. She funded legal defenses for black men falsely accused. She spoke at rallies and organized boycotts. The same strategic mind that had dominated the underworld now turned its attention to a different kind of war, the fight for equality. But while Stephanie was finding redemption, Bumpy Johnson was facing judgment. 1937. Federal agents arrested Bumpy on drug charges. Conspiracy to distribute heroin. The evidence was circumstantial, but the verdict was certain. In America, black men didn't need to be guilty. They just needed to be inconvenient. Bumpy Johnson was sentenced to 15 years, and not just any prison. Alcatraz, the Rock, the most notorious federal penitentiary in America, a place designed to break men. It didn't break Bumpy. For 11 years, Bumpy Johnson survived Alcatraz. He read voraciously. He studied law. He became a model prisoner, which is another way of saying he learned to hide his true nature behind a mask of compliance. And every day, he remembered what Stephanie had taught him: patience, strategy, the long game. When Bumpy was finally released in 1948, he returned to a Harlem that had changed. The numbers racket had been absorbed by the Italian families. The old guard was gone or dead, and Stephanie St. Clair, though still respected, had moved on from the life. But Bumpy Johnson hadn't moved on. He'd evolved. The man who stepped off the train at Penn Station wasn't the street enforcer who'd been arrested 11 years earlier. This was Bumpy Johnson, the strategist, the businessman, the legend. And within 5 years, he'd become what Stephanie always knew he could be: the undisputed king of Harlem. Bumpy ran the rackets. He controlled the heroin trade. He partnered with the Italian families as an equal, not a subordinate. And he protected Harlem with the same fierce loyalty Stephanie had shown him decades earlier. Because everything Bumpy Johnson became, every move he made, every victory he achieved, was built on a foundation Stephanie St. Clair had constructed. And he never forgot it. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, as Bumpy's power grew and his legend spread, he maintained a quiet but unwavering respect for Stephanie. He visited her. He sought her counsel. He ensured she never wanted for anything, not out of obligation, out of reverence. Because Bumpy Johnson understood something most people didn't. Stephanie St. Clair hadn't just been his boss. She'd been his architect. She'd taken a weapon and transformed it into a king, and kings remember their makers. The end came for Bumpy on July 7, 1968. He was having dinner at Wells Restaurant in Harlem, a meal with friends, a normal evening, and then his heart stopped. Bumpy Johnson, the most feared man in Harlem, died not in a shootout or an ambush, but quietly, over coffee and conversation. He was 62 years old. Stephanie St. Clair outlived him by nearly a decade. She spent her final years in comfort, financially secure, politically active, and largely forgotten by a world that had never truly known her in the first place. She died in 1969, not violently, not dramatically. She simply went to sleep one night in her home and didn't wake up. The Queen of Numbers passed quietly, the way she'd always preferred to operate. In the shadows, misunderstood, underestimated until it was too late. The newspapers barely noticed. A few obituaries mentioned her numbers operation. None of them understood what she'd really accomplished. Because Stephanie St. Clair's greatest achievement wasn't building a criminal empire. It was building Bumpy Johnson. Without Stephanie, there would be no Godfather of Harlem, no legend, no king. Bumpy Johnson became an icon because Stephanie St. Clair had the vision to see what he could become and the patience to teach him how to get there. She was the architect. He was the cathedral. History remembers Bumpy Johnson, movies, television shows, books. His name echoes through popular culture as the embodiment of black power and resistance, and he deserves that recognition. But history forgot Stephanie St. Clair. Until now. Because here's what you need to understand. Stephanie St. Clair didn't just survive the Italian mob, she defeated them. And she didn't do it with violence or intimidation. She did it with one perfectly crafted message, that legendary telegram she sent to Dutch Schultz's deathbed. The words that proved she was smarter, sharper, and more dangerous than any gangster in America. If you want to know what that telegram said, and why it became the most legendary message in organized crime history, click the video on your screen right now. Because those words reveal everything you need to know about Stephanie St. Clair. Her brilliance, her ruthlessness, her absolute refusal to be anything less than victorious. And to make sure you don't miss the next chapter from the underworld archives, the stories history tried to bury, the legends who shaped America from the shadows, hit that subscribe button now. Because this is just the beginning. There are more names you don't know, more architects who built empires in silence, more kings and queens who changed the world without anyone noticing. Stephanie St. Clair was a black woman in 1920s America who became more powerful than the mob. She transformed a street fighter into a legend. She won a war against Dutch Schultz without firing a shot. And history almost forgot her name. But we won't let that happen. Not anymore. This was the story of Madame St. Clair, the Queen of Numbers, the woman who made The Godfather. Remember her name.